Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our WIT event. I'll give everybody another few seconds to make sure that they're in the room. To keep us on time, I think I'll go ahead and start. So my name is Susanna Choi, and I am one of the co-chairs of WIT's Environment and Energy section. I am absolutely delighted to welcome you to the first of a series of programs that will delve into the many energy and climate issues that are impacting trade dynamics. Some of the issues we plan to cover this year include the energy transition, environment, social and governance, or ESG trends, and more. So please do keep an eye out for these upcoming events. Today's event, our inaugural event to kick things off, is centered on the carbon border tariff or adjustment and the role that it will play as part of the ambitious emission reduction agendas in the US and in the European Union. The debate over a carbon import levy has certainly gotten louder of late, with proposals and plans coming out of Brussels, and now the US with recent legislative proposal. We are incredibly fortunate to have an impressive panel of speakers share their thoughts on the current debate when it comes to carbon border adjustments. Jennifer Hillman has a storied bio that we could probably spend the entire hour on without scratching the surface. She is a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and a former member of the WTO appellate body. Just so you know, we'll be dropping into the chat box links to Jennifer's recent work on border adjustment and carbon prices. We are also fortunate to have joining us not one, but two speakers who have held many roles in the EU trade space and are now spending much of their time focused on the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism. Colin Brown is head of the Legal Aspects Unit on Trade and Sustainable Development and Investment in the Directorate General for Trade of the European Commission. Previously, he litigated WTO and EU law cases when he was at the Legal Service of the European Commission. Pasquale D'Amico is policy officer in the European Commission's unit in charge of the carbon border adjustment mechanism in the Directorate General for Taxation and Customs Union. Among his many previous roles, he has served as trade counselor in the Italian permanent representations to the EU and to the WTO. And we are very fortunate to have as our moderator, Vanessa Shara. Vanessa is Vice President of Trade and International Competitiveness for the American Clean Power Association, and she is also President-elect for WIT. Vanessa was previously Vice President for Legal Affairs and Trade and Investment Policy at the National Foreign Trade Council. She has also served in the USTR and Department of Justice. Please note that all questions are to be posted in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Now, I very much look forward to the discussion, and we'll hand it over to Vanessa now. Thank you.
Thanks, Susanna, and a special shout out to Susanna, who is the inspiration for this event. It was her idea, and to Jennifer Riccardi of the European Commission, who was hugely helpful in putting together our panel. This really is the marquee panel on this topic, I think, this week. I know it's interesting to me that we didn't really think that much about it, but we picked the week when the European and American negotiators were meeting in Pittsburgh to talk about lots of issues, including this issue, I'm sure, because you can't really avoid this issue. My favorite quote about this issue and the TTC is that no trade agenda would be complete without a nod to the existential threat posed by climate change. And many people have speculated that there was discussion at the meetings, and some reporting has suggested that there was discussion about calculations of greenhouse gases emissions in trade and how to look at this from a global perspective. So I think this is a very topical moment at which to talk about this. I'm just very excited for the panel. As Susanna mentioned, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. I will be doing some moderated questions at the end, but we have a big agenda. We will start with Pasquale, who will provide us with a very, I think, thorough overview of the CBAM as seen from the European perspective. Colin will then comment on some of the WTO aspects. Then Jennifer will speak about US perspectives, and I'm sure also comment on the WTO perspectives, and then we will do some moderated questions. So we have a lot to cover. I'm going to turn things over to Pasquale, and he's going to share a PowerPoint which will take us into the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you, Susanna. This is a great honor for me to be here and share with you a couple of views on this wonderful new instrument, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, to which I have contributed and I was among the drafters together with Colin on the side of Digitrade. So the instrument was released as a proposal of the Commission on the 14th of July and is now submitted to the views of the co-legislators, to the Council and to the European Parliament, and is based on certain assumptions that I will try to convey clearly also in order to dispel some misconception about it. So first of all, this instrument is part of a wider package of 8 legislative proposals at the moment, whose aim is to reduce carbon emissions by 55% in 2030. We have conceived the instrument in order to mirror the EU emission trading system, which is the European system to carbon price, where a price is negotiated every day, and we have a daily price for that. We will mirror this price and this system in a regulatory instrument that is supposed to comply with the WTO, to focus on carbon intensive instrument. And it is an alternative to the free allowances of EU ETS. So basically, so far in certain sectors deemed at risk of carbon leakage, companies were not paying for the exact price. Now, as we want to increase the ambition, the climate ambition of our instrument, we will get rid of these free allowances because the price signal is not correct there with the free allowances, and we will install instead this new instrument, the Carbon Border Adjustment. Carbon Border Adjustment is built around 2 pillars: equal carbon pricing and no double pricing. So basically, EU business will pay a carbon price on their production in the EU, and imports will pay the same. Will pay a price, a carbon adjustment that corresponds to the price that we have in the EU, with a small difference, the tiny difference that the price is settled on a daily basis in the EU, and the carbon border adjustment is established on a weekly basis for administrative reasons. At the same time, we have this principle, no double pricing. So wherever you are paying a carbon price abroad, this price will be discounted upon importation into the EU. The objective, the aim of this instrument is purely climate. It's a climate instrument, it's not a trade instrument, it's not a level playing field instrument. It's totally different. It has a regulatory nature, and it mirrors the EU ETS with this small adjustment. I mentioned the daily prices, but we have also the tradability of certificates, the limits of certificates that does not exist in CBAM. It would be at odds with the WTO. The validity over time that is 2 years, while EU instruments have a longer validity, and the declarative system which changes. All these changes are duly justified, and I will explain later on. We will start on certain sectors. We will start on cement, iron and steel, aluminum, fertilizers, and electricity. All these sectors have been chosen on the basis of 3 criteria: the risk of carbon leakage, the fact that they cover a substantial part of emissions. In the EU is 45% of total CO2 emissions, but on a global scale is more than half, and on the practical feasibility. Then in a second stage, we will look into the extensions to other sectors. This instrument will have a gradual phase in, so we conceive a transitional phase where we will only ask information to the companies. Companies will continue to export to the EU, and we will look into the data, because these data are essential to build and to strengthen our system that will start hopefully in 2026. And from 2026 in the following 10 years, it will enter progressively into force, while at the same time we will have a joint decline, a joint phase out of the ETS free allowances. So this progressive system of substitution of the free allowances is maybe explained in later here. Voila. So in the first phase, in the transitional phase, as you can see on the left column, all emissions are covered by free allocation. So CBAM is not into force, is not asking any correction. In the first 3 years, you won't pay anything, just produce information. That's why we indicate here CBAM info. Then in the following 10 years, you will pay partially CBAM according to the part that of emissions that is not covered by the free allocation. When the system will be completely into force, so after 2036, the CBAM charge will cover all the emissions. Now, the design of the CBAM is based on certain strict parameters. First of all, we have non-discrimination among third countries. The only exceptions exist because of a strict linkage to the EU ETS, and it's the case of Norway, Iceland, and Switzerland. This is not a relevant exception in the sense that there is discrimination, because the system, as I explained before, is based on equal pricing. So these countries are paying already in their jurisdiction the same carbon price that European companies pay, and they are linked with our system. So there is no need to apply any correction, but there will be correction for products imported into Norway and then re-exported to the EU until Norway apply a CBAM at its border. So in order to avoid any trade diversion, if Chinese products are imported into Norway and then from Norway to Sweden, they will pay the adjustment until Norway is setting the same system. As I said, we have the principle of avoidance of double taxation. So we'll deduct any explicit carbon price paid in third countries, and the selection of products is duly justified. The system mirrors the EU ETS with certain caveat, certain difference related to the fact that there is no cap and trade. In the EU, we have a cap and trade. We can pollute until a certain extent. And if you want to pollute more, we have to buy from other companies these certificates. Abroad, we cannot do that. We cannot impose a limit. And that's why the tradability of this system is limited. There is only a system of buyback. So companies from third countries, imagine American companies, they can give back their certificate. It's a buyback system of 1/3 of certificate. Now imagine that the price is in any case going up, and it will progressively going up together with our ambition of reducing emissions. That's why the companies will have no interest in principle in buying certificate and giving them back, because it will be done at the same price of the purchase. So this is just an adjustment, it's just a clause of flexibility for companies. What is the relation of the CBAM with the EU FTAs? There is no relation, basically, because the purpose is different, because FTAs have a trade liberalization purpose, while CBAM has a climate purpose. There is no provision in our FTAs concerning CBAM, and that's why even countries with which we have an FTA will pay exactly the same than other countries. So the CBAM and the ETS, they diverge in small details, but CBAM will have a phase out in conjunction with the free allowances. That is essential. We don't impose any double pricing, any double protection. Any double protection is granted to the EU companies. The international dimension of this instrument is what we are discussing now, and where many third countries and third partners are interested in. We are having bilateral discussions with many countries, with the US, for example, in the TTC as well, and in the WTO. In the G20, there was a communique in July inviting the use of carbon pricing mechanisms as incentives. What we are trying to do is to fix the individual situation of third country companies, because our system is based on actual emission methodology. So it means that efficient companies will pay exactly like European efficient companies. So this I will demonstrate with a small simulation later on. We said that certain countries are excluded. We mentioned the deduction. There is a possibility of having international agreements on how to take into account carbon price, but for that you need to fix and to establish an explicit carbon price. And then we have special rules on electricity for neighboring countries whose electricity grid is integrated with ours. So to sum up, and this is important because I will explain now with some simulation how calculation of CBAM can work. CBAM impacts companies, not countries. Companies are subject to border adjustment on individual merits because we'll take into account the level of reallocation and the individual performance, apart from the carbon price paid domestically. The country-wide exemption I mentioned for Norway, for example, exists until they pay the same price. If they diverge, they will pay the same. It's not is a system that is dynamic and works until everyone pay the same price. So an example of adjustment. We start from a simple case. The number of certificate here is defined by the actual emission of the installation producing imported product minus the emission covered by free allocation into the EU. This will be multiplied for the average weekly price, and again, we will deduct the carbon price paid abroad. The final result will be the adjustment. To concrete numbers, with some example, we have a situation like that. In the first line, you see a producer which is producing 2.5 ton of CO2 per ton of steel. Then we apply the formula. So we deduct the free allowance, we multiply for the price, and we have a certain result, 100 euro for ton of steel. In the second line, you have an efficient producer who's able to decline its emission intensity from 2.5 to 1.5. This decline may be done because the producer is investing in a green economy or because of regulation in his countries. That's something that where the US are leading in that moment with more than 2,000 climate-related measures. This is an example where we have a carbon price paid abroad. So again, a producer with 2.5 ton of steel of CO2 minus the level that we imagine in 2030 will be the level of the free allowances, half, 0.5, multiplied for the price, and deducting, in that case, a simulated carbon price paid abroad. The result is the following, that as you can see in the green column, you have on the second one a very efficient EU producer. The very efficient is the 10% of the best producers into the EU. This is an indicative EU benchmark for steel. Indicative, I repeat, because in reality it would be slightly over. And a third country producer, which is very effective, and in decarbonization will have exactly the same level. The consequence is that the carbon price and the adjustment will be the same. In the second column here, you see that the European producer will pay 0.5 ton that are deducted and will pay 0.5. The same will apply for the third countries. All the other examples, the other column relate to third country 1, third country 2, third country 3, that as I am on record, I cannot say whose country are, but there are cases like that of countries who are polluting more than the double than ours, depending on their productive process for the production of steel or fertilizers and so on. So what is the impact on partner countries? It depends. Countries with an emission trading system aligned, I said, will be excluded, but regulatory measures will be taken into account and will reduce the level of the adjustment. International agreement we mentioned, it's a system that we can have with countries with an explicit carbon price. Canada is among the first candidates. And these are the countries that are affected for the EU. As you can see, the US is not here. In cement, Turkey will be the first impacted country. In fertilizers, it will be Russia. In iron and steel will be China and Russia. In aluminum will be Norway, which is excluded, so Russia again. The USA are covered for the in our product scope only for 0.7% of total export average of the latest 5 years, so excluding the 2020, which was a special year. The level of export of the US in this is only 1.5, and it's especially steel and aluminum. So I would stop here. I hope that this explanation was clear enough. I could reply to other questions, but I will be happy also for Colin to describe the WTO compatibility of this system that we have tried to carefully design in compliance with all WTO rules. Thank you so much.
Okay, Colin, you're up.
Great. Thank you very much, and thank you for having invited me to take part in this discussion. I'm going to be very short. I'm not going to use a PowerPoint presentation because Pascale, I think, has explained very well how the system is intended to function. So I'm just going to say a few words about how, in our view, this fits in the WTO. Conscious that I think in the audience we have some people that are extremely expert in WTO and others who maybe are a bit less familiar. So our starting point in developing this is thinking about, in particular, the GATT rules, where non-discriminatory measures are regarded as consistent with the GATT rules, and if there is discrimination that is identified in a particular piece of legislation, then that discrimination may in certain circumstances be justified where the measure pursues an objective that is recognized in the exceptions clause of the GATT, which is Article 20. Now, as Pascale was explaining in more detail, the way we've tried to design CBAM is precisely to ensure that it is non-discriminatory. So there is, under no circumstances, is less favorable treatment granted to importers. And we've tried to design it in such a way that it falls, and we believe that it falls under Article 3, paragraph 4 of the GATT, because it is we have conceived it as a regulatory instrument, and essentially as the mirror to the emissions trading system. So all of the features of CBAM, which Pascale has described, or which you can see when reading the proposal, are designed to mirror what is provided for in the EU's emissions trading system. Now, of course, there are certain elements which cannot be mirrored as such. Pascale explained those, precisely because in the emissions trading scheme, we can focus on installations and their yearly or annual production of CO2, whilst for imported products, we have to focus on the products themselves when they come in, and they're coming in at a particular moment in time. They may be exported at one moment and they may not be exports for the future. So we've had to take into account these different underlying elements and provide for specific treatment for such circumstances. But we think we've done that in a way, again, that ensures that when viewed in the whole, so when the treatment provided under the CBAM compared to the treatment provided under the ETS, when viewed in a whole, there's not less favorable treatment of imported products. And as I mentioned, even if this were not to be the case, any circumstances where there might be a potential breach of Article 3, paragraph 4 can be justified under the exceptions to GATT under Article 20. Here, again, as I don't think I need to explain, the objective is an environmental one. It is to provide an effective means to stop carbon leakage, and carbon leakage is problematic because the concern is that it will lead to the displacement of production in countries with less stringent environmental measures, with the effect that the global effect of the EU ramping up the effectiveness of the emissions trading scheme and the displacement to third countries would be an increase overall in greenhouse gas emissions, and that obviously is something which we are keen to avoid. And I think I just really wanted to make very briefly those points. Just also to say we've had a number of discussions on CBAM in the WTO. A number of WTO members have asked questions on this in the Committee on Environment and the Committee on Trade and Goods, and we have engaged there and discussed this. But we're also seeing action, and the EU is pushing this to put in place a work program on environmental, in particular climate related issues. And work is ongoing on that, with a view to launching a dedicated work plan as of the ministerial, the 12th ministerial, which is just coming up, with a view to delivering hopefully concrete outcomes at the following ministry. And with that very short comment on the WTO situation, I'll hand back the floor. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Colin. Okay, I'm going to pass the floor to Jennifer to do a presentation on the US side and US perspectives, and also her WTO perspective. She's in Geneva, by the way, so she's in a perfect position to give us her thoughts on what people are talking about there. So go ahead, Jennifer.
Well, thank you very, very much. And greetings from Geneva, where I am here because this week is the WTO's public forum going on this week, in addition to all of the activities in Pittsburgh and elsewhere. So I will bring you greetings from Geneva, and I will just give you two quick comments on what's happening here at the public forum. Part of it, the comment I'll make it at the start, because this is a Women in International Trade event, I will tell you that normally at the public forum, there's a lot of various receptions and a lot of sort of exchanges of people meeting and greeting. And I will tell you that this year, the public forum has had almost none of that, with the sole exception of the coolest, most happening place to be in the entire week of the public forum was an event put on by the Trade Experts. And I'm sure that there are a fair number of experts on this phone, on this call. So again, my congratulations to all the women out there that have been involved in or included in that Trade Experts camp. And the second thing I will comment from this WTO public forum is that if you look at the 105 sessions that are being held this week, almost a quarter of them touch on the issues around sustainability and the relationship between the environment and trade, and a good number, 5 or 6 of them specifically on climate change and trade, and 2 full panels solely on this issue of carbon taxes. So the issue of today's seminar is also very much alive and well, and the subject of a lot of these discussions in Geneva. Let me just comment on the 2 things that Vanessa asked me to touch on. One is, what is the United States' response to the European CBAM proposal? And I think there the honest answer is it's quite muted. Again, not very much in the way of response. And to me, that makes absolutely good sense that there is a muted response because of a number of things. First is the timeline. I mean, at the end of the day, these duties are not actually going to be collected until 2025. And again, that assumes that this proposal does go through the entire European Union process, which I won't comment on, but I'm just saying there's a lag time here. So there's not this immediate reaction from US producers. 2023, I'm sorry, did I missay that date in any event? It's a ways out. Second, I think as Pascale's notions say, very few US exports are going to be affected by the initial imposition. So again, there's just not a reason for the United States to all of a sudden just get all upset about this when there's very little US trade that's going to be impacted. Third, I would say, is the European Union has worked really hard to make this proposal consistent with its WTO obligations. So at some level, it begs the question, where and why and for what reason would the United States have to complain about this European CBAM proposal if it is in fact consistent with the European Union's obligations under the WTO. Fourth, the EU has done a lot of consultations along the way, and more will occur as this process goes through the European Parliament and all of those processes. Those views can or would be taken on board. So I think it's understandable that so far the US response has been somewhat muted. And I also commend WIT and I commend Colin and Pasquale for being here, because I think part of the way that you keep the message, sort of a little bit muted in the United States, is to keep educating us all on what you're doing, why, when, where, and how, because I think that can help avoid, huge problems. The last reason why I say I think the US has been a little bit muted is because of what may be coming in the United States. And what may be coming may be significantly less likely to be viewed as consistent with the WTO. So again, I think the United States, it's a little bit of that when you're sitting in a glass house, do you really want to start throwing stones? I think there's a little bit of reluctance there, because what may be coming is a US imposition of a border adjustment mechanism of some kind, a border tax, what is referred to in the budget reconciliation bill as a carbon polluter importer fee. But this may be coming. It was included in the Senate passed reconciliation bill that there will be some form of a fee imposed on imports, details to be worked out. And again, that raises a couple of issues. One is whenever details are worked out in a reconciliation bill, you do not have what the European Union has done with lots of consultations, lots of discussions, lots of backing and forthing about how the details are all going to be worked out, because it gets put into this huge big bill that just gets passed in the middle of the night and people have to sort out all the details later. So again, just a little bit of a concern there. The second one is, to the extent that we know anything, what was introduced was a bill by Senator Coons that is basically saying that the amount of the border charge is going to be the equivalent of the cost to US producers to comply with the entire panoply of US regulations on various forms of environmental regulations and controls that are done through regulation. And that presents a huge problem for the United States from a WTO standpoint, because the basic rule is exactly as has been described. Yes, can you put a tax on imports, which would otherwise violate the WTO? I mean, everybody has said, I will not charge a tariff that is higher than my bound rates. I won't do that. So the US and the European Union have bound rates. So any of these additional taxes are going to exceed those bound rates. So the question is, can you do that? Can you effectively break all of your tariff bindings? Answer, yes, if what you're doing is imposing a tax that is the equivalent of a domestic tax, right? So that you can do. The problem for the United States is we don't have a domestic tax on carbon. So the issue becomes, can you actually impose a border adjustment to offset a domestic tax when you don't have a domestic tax? And that's what's going to be very problematic for the United States. The other way in which you can do this is under Article 3.4 of the GATT. It's considered a domestic regulation. So again, can you apply, in essence, a domestic regulation to an import? Again, only if it's not discriminatory. And so for the United States, the huge push is going to be, can you prove that this is not discriminatory? When it's very hard to show, how much was this amount that domestic producers are paying. And the last thing I'll say is there's generally this notion that you can border adjust for taxes that are considered indirect, a charge on the good itself. What you cannot border adjust for are what is considered a direct tax. That's like an income tax, a tax on a producer. And here again, it's going to be hard for the United States because the cost of regulation is likely to be viewed as the equivalent of a direct tax on a producer, not an indirect tax on a product. So even whether you fit into the box of eligible for border adjustment, again, may be problematic for the United States. But then I want to step back and just close with the sort of bigger picture of where does this leave us? Because this is where I think I'm very grateful to the European Union for starting this conversation. And I think it's one that needs to be continued, because it's very clear, I think, to everyone in the world that countries that are serious about getting to net zero by 2050 are taking different approaches to getting there. The European Union has obviously taken an emissions trading system approach with the idea of a border adjustment. Other places have chosen direct carbon taxes. Others, like the United States, are choosing a combination of lots of regulations, ultimately bans on, various things, a regulatory approach, and in the United States, combined with a subsidies approach. We are going to provide a lot of financing for green technology, a lot of financing for R&D to create a lot more renewable energy, a lot of subsidizing of, shifting to renewable energy. So in the United States, it is likely to be a combination of regulation and subsidies, if you will, support for green technology. And the issue is, if we are all working for the same goal, everybody's trying to get to net zero by 2050. Is there a way to do that without fighting with each other over your way's better than my way, or I'm going to retaliate against your carbon taxes, et cetera? And again, so this is where, for those of us like me that are in this space, there is just this huge sense of, could we please come up with some way to again, talk with each other, to keep figuring out whether we can agree that we're doing what is, at the end of the day, from a climate perspective, equivalent. Or again, we're going to keep putting pressure on one another to reach an equivalent goal. Could we not have internal and external fights with one another over the methodologies by which we get there? Whether we're forming some kind of a carbon club, whether we're starting to think about whether there could be some form of a carbon customs union, whether we can get there. Because again, there are all of these other issues that come up with anybody's approach. I mean, even from what the European Union is doing, it starts to raise this issue of how far downstream do you have to go to have an effective policy? Is it just steel, or are we going to start going downstream to everything that is made from steel? Because as we saw, when the United States put 25% tariffs on steel, what happened? We started to see huge increases in imports of nails and this, that, and the other. I mean, all of the products that are downstream of that tariff. And again, then do you have to start capturing all of those, or are you going to see carbon leakage in all of the downstream products? So you start getting that kind of an issue raised. You also start getting huge issues about the complexity of it. I mean, how many forms? How are you measuring? How are you assuring that the measurements are all correct? How do we know how many tons of GHG were really admitted? How much transparency is in the process? How good is the data? How many taxpayers are going to be involved in this? How complicated is it going to be to fill out the European Union's forms, become an importer of record that keeps all of that? The more bells and whistles we add to the system in order to make sure we're getting the equivalence perfect, the discrimination is perfectly correct, the more complicated it becomes. So again, I say, could we step back a little bit and give everybody a little bit of breathing room by saying, if it's close enough, if it's good enough, we're not going to spend incredible amounts of time and energy getting every last little thing correct, except for the, and then two other last comments. One that is going to raise a lot of issues is, what are we all doing with the revenue that we're raising through these taxes? Because that cuts both ways. Again, right now, as I understand it in the European Union system, it's going to go into the general revenues of the European Union. And again, the fact in the United States that it's in budget reconciliation is because they want to raise revenue to offset some of the costs of the $3.5 trillion package. So far, the countries that are looking at this are saying, this is our money, we're using it for general revenue. As soon as you do that, it does start to beg the question, is this really an environmental measure, or is this really a revenue raiser? And so you are going to see a lot of that skepticism, because in the end of the day, and you heard both Pasquale and Colin both say at least twice, this is an environmental measure. It's not a trade measure, and again, they would argue, I think it's not a protectionist measure, but will it be actually seen that way by the world if all of the revenues are going to the European Union? And what neither of them said, but what is the reality is, who is the driver to impose carbon border adjustments? Who is the driver? The industries that feel like they're going to be hurt. What do they want? They want protectionism. And so even though it is couched in all of these environmental terms, and again, I do want to commend the European Union for their approach, at the end of the day, the concern is whether others will say, no, at heart, this was all about protecting the European steel industry. This was all about protecting European, aluminum producers. And it isn't really an environmental measure. And part of the way that you can defend against that may be where are the revenues going? And part of it is to the extent to which you are using this to create cleaner steel technology that you are then sharing with the world. So that's the other part of it, is for the developing countries to look at what are they going to get out of this. If all they're getting is the obligation to pay a lot more taxes when they're shipping, you're going to start to see more of these pushes over where do we go with this. So again, just a few thoughts to begin our conversation.
Well, I feel obligated to let Pasquale and Colin respond a bit, and I am curious. We did get a question actually about the revenue issue. So, could you guys, feel free to respond, but could you specifically answer the question about what the European Union is thinking about the revenue, and also there was a question about where this proposal is in terms of the Parliament and the Council. Just sort of procedural question.
Thank you so much. If Colin doesn't mind, I start with this one on the revenues. So we'll have another legislative instrument proposed by the end of the year, which will include the CBAM revenues together with other revenues that we are negotiating, including with the US, like the minimum corporate tax, and these will have the reply. So I agree with Jennifer that we shouldn't include this money in the general budget. Earmarking may also have some downsides, but in general, we tend to address all this money into an innovation fund whose aim is to allow companies to decarbonize. So it's exactly what Jennifer said. In any case, this will be clear by the end of the year after the new instrument is proposed. About the legislative process, as you saw, we tend to say that the system will be enforced in 2023 with a dry run, so enforced but without asking money. For that, we need to conclude by then a legislative process that is made on several plans. First of all, we have the primary rules, which need to be approved by the Parliament and by the Council, but we have also secondary rules, more than 10 implementing acts, which will define certain detailed aspects like how the importers will make their declaration, or what is the case for goods imported, and imported here is not the correct word, into the exclusive economic zone, for example, into the platform, offshore platforms, for example. So all of these needs to be clarified, but we cannot work on the secondary rules until we approve the primary one. So the Council and the Parliament will take their time. We are confident so far that the Parliament has a fixed time. The timeline is not yet published, but the Parliament has to decide also on the new ETS, because remember that CBAM is the external aspect of ETS, and ETS is going to be strengthened. It will be stronger. Because of the stronger ETS, we'll have the carbon price going up and the risk of carbon leakage going up. I don't know if Colin wants to conclude on that, add anything. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I wasn't going to say very much other than I think to pick up on the point of the objective behind it. I mean, of course, any regulatory measure is going to have different types of impacts, and legislators and governments are working in the real world. But this really forms part of what is called the Fit for 55 package, which is a swathe of different actions which the Commission at this moment is proposing, which are going into legislative process, which are designed to make a number of radical changes to the European economy with a view to greening them. And whilst there of course there will be impacts for industry, this is very much driven by, well, how do we ensure that the legislative actions that we're taking spur and drive a system where we are removing greenhouse gas emissions from the industrial world. If I can put it as bluntly as that. So that's really very much the objective. And you see also in the EU an awful lot of activity on regulating in greenhouse gas efficient ways, also looking at subsidies to help with the transformation more broadly as well. I mean, ultimately, CBAM, if it works well, will stop actually producing any revenue at some point in the future, because we will get to the point where the products being imported are low, have low carbon intensity, and therefore it won't make much sense to keep the CBAM in the medium to long term. That's ultimately what we're trying to do. It won't happen quickly, of course, but that's the ultimate objective.
So Colin, while I have you on speaker, could you, I'm curious, Jennifer raised an interesting point about sort of where this should be discussed. And the WTO seems like an obvious place, but we're also hearing the OECD is interested. We're hearing there's some talk about doing a NATO climate club or doing something in the G20. So thoughts on whether the WTO is the best place or whether there are other fora that might be better?
So, I mean, I think there, and I think this picks up some of the points that Jennifer was making. I mean, I think there is a great deal of interest in finding ways on the EU side that we can cooperate and develop standards or approaches that are common across different countries. Where exactly that discussion takes place, how that develops, is something that we need to see. There's partly the transatlantic element of that, which you mentioned in your introduction. There are our efforts to, which I mentioned, to start more focused work in the WTO that would also cover carbon pricing. And there are also ideas to work on these issues in the OECD. I think we're looking and we're engaging, and we will engage in all of these. I think in a sense, the WTO, and I think it's largely a question also of the scope and the broadness of these discussions. So the broader, from our perspective, the better. The broader there is an agreement on approaches, then the better. And I think what the regulation, the proposed regulation foresees in particular, is cooperation and potential international agreements on carbon pricing, methodologies around carbon pricing, where I think we see the greatest possibility for converging, at least on approaches. I think going a step further and other countries kind of adopting the identical system to the EU, that's incorporating around that. I think that's a more complicated exercise, because I think, again, as Jennifer was talking about, this is in many ways intimately linked with what is being done internally. And as we explained, the CBAM is the external representation or the mirror of the emissions trading scheme. So the extent of the cooperation, I think, is something that needs to be seen, but the idea of multiplying and developing cooperation is something that certainly on the EU side we're very interested in doing.
So I have a question for Jennifer that is sort of then follows from this, which is, we look at the Biden administration and we know this is on their radar screen. Who's got point? I mean, what's your sense of who's sort of toiling in the fields here in terms of the agencies, the White House? Do we have a sense of kind of who's running this or who's responsible? We know the Hill is churning out ideas. What's your take on what's going on in sort of the administration side and who's sort of running this?
Well, again, a good question, and the truth is, I don't know the answer. Obviously, you know, Special Envoy John Kerry is sort of overseeing the overall sort of international approach to what we're doing. And I you know, sort of interesting in your question, left out of your which are the agencies that ought to be or the institutions, was the UNFCCC. You know, so some of it has also got to be figured out as part of what is going to happen at the COP meeting coming up in Glasgow, and then, you know, sort of feeding into WTO meetings, et cetera. Obviously, if you asked anyone from the Biden administration, they would say fighting climate change is a whole of government effort. And I think you can see that there are pieces of all of this that are really, you know, being driven by a number of agencies. But if you really sort of drill down to it, I think at the end of the day, the real work is arguably going to be done at the Treasury Department in terms of whether something gets folded within, again, a whole series of tax proposals. I mean, whether it gets somehow a carbon tax concept gets linked in with minimum corporate tax debates or other things that are occurring under the auspices of the OECD. So I think you will see Treasury have some role in that. And then secondly, I would say it is going to be the U.S. Commerce Department that's going to have a huge role. And they're going to have a huge role on both sides of this. And again, I don't know whether it's going to happen, but there has been some discussion about the possibility of a Section 232. This is this national security investigation that would focus on climate change and that would say that imports of high carbon emitting products is a risk to the national security of the United States. And therefore, that would provide a legal authority for the United States to impose some kind of a carbon tax. Again, those 232 cases are driven out of the Commerce Department. And obviously the Commerce Department has the control over the other side of this, the subsidy side, the investments in green technology, and to some degree, some of the regulatory pieces there. The EPA has got a huge role in a lot of the other, environmental pieces of it. And then if we were to get serious about an actual trade agreement kind of an approach, then I think you would clearly see USTR step into that, particularly if there is this notion that we're going to somehow create effectively a carbon customs union, because that really then would require huge efforts to think about, can you get a waiver from Article 24? Because clearly, even if you could do this, where you had a club of people that internally didn't charge carbon tariffs on one another, but externally charged a similar carbon tax on everybody external to the club, that is not going to be consistent with Article 24 of the GATT, because it's not trade liberalizing, it's trade restricting to start adding on tariffs. So you would need waivers, and again, so that is going to be clearly, first of all, a long time down the road. So this is not a road I'm necessarily advocating, because I think getting that kind of an agreement and that kind of a waiver would be really tough. And the problem for the whole world is there are certain countries, and I would say personally, I would say start with the G7. I mean, start with more like-minded countries that might be more willing to it, maybe expand to the OECD. But if you think about who are going to be the big critics of the European Union CBAM, I mean, who's going to be out of the box first challenging it? It's going to be Russia. It's going to be Turkey. It's going to be, maybe China. It is not going to be the countries that are necessarily going to want to join whatever this carbon club, carbon grouping, like-minded set is. So I do think, there needs to be some thought about where are the best forums to do it. And like I said, I think in the United States, it will not start as a trade issue.
So I can't resist raising the elephant in the room issue, which is China. So I'm curious to know if you think that depending on what forum is chosen, there would be some thought to choosing a forum that is exclusive of certain countries that may not be very interested in this, or if you're hearing that the Chinese are somewhat interested. I mean, you all have a Geneva connection that I don't. So give me some thoughts on the Chinese piece of this and how China views this, and whether we should seek a forum in which to discuss this that excludes the Chinese. I'm going to say,
I don't know who you want to start. All right.
Why
I'll
don't
say
you go
something
first?
really quickly. I mean, a couple of interesting things on China. Obviously, China has now established their own emissions trading system that is just sort of coming on board. I don't know whether that's because they now realize that they're going to want to get credit with the European Union for their system. But again, they are at least saying, we don't know yet how robust it is. It appears that the carbon price within China right now would be quite low, meaning this, whatever this system is, hasn't yet, doesn't really yet have any bite. But, that's one thing. Second thing, sort of interestingly, Xi Jinping, president of China, at the United Nations announced that China would stop funding coal-fired power plants abroad. I'm sorry, stop building coal-fired power plants abroad. So I think China is starting to hear this message that they are not welcome on the world stage if they're going to continue what they've done under the Belt and Road Initiative, build 240 coal-fired power plants or more, all of which have somewhere between a 35 to 50-year life cycle. So again, they're slowly getting this message that they are making it harder, not easier, for the world to fight climate change, and they've got to stop. Now, again, a lot of wiggle words in that we're going to stop building coal-fired plants. Well, what about the 17 that are already in the pipeline? Are you going to stop those? And the other issue coming out of China is this push. So again, who is the #1 producer in the world of solar, of wind, of geothermal, of hydro? That's China. I mean, they have the technology, they have the big companies, but they haven't readily been sharing it with the rest of the world. They're sharing coal-fired power. So, the issue is how much pressure there can be put on China to start sharing a lot of their green technology much more readily and stop immediately the financing and building of coal.
If I may, I totally agree with Jennifer. China has a great responsibility here, and probably the real game changer as far as CBAM is concerned is the entry into force of the phase 2, because there we will look also into scope 2 emissions. For non-technicians, it means the energy used as an input. So this is not in CBAM today, it's not in the CBAM first phase, but we'll have a revision phase starting already in 2025. In 2026, it will be completed. If we were including the energy as an input, China is a real big polluter, because what Jennifer said, these coal-powered plants are the origin of the aluminium production, for example. This is not in for the moment, but when it will be in, yes, it will be very, very hardly it. And we hope that this plan to implement a carbon price in China and to implement and to not to build new coal power plant will be followed. Thank you so much.
So I have a question for Colin. I'm going to follow up on something you raised. So this idea of a work program at the WTO. So for people who don't know the WTO, what does that mean? What is the scope of a work program, and how would that sort of be populated?
Well, it's a good question, and it's something which is under discussion as we speak. The World Trade Organization has a Committee on Trade and Environment, which I think has been established for a good 20, if not more, years. And it provides a forum for precisely discussing the intersection of trade and environmental issues. Now, with the ministerial conference, which is coming up at the end of November, there are a significant number of countries that are trying to put together part of the ministerial declaration, which would then set out a program of work across the next number of months until the next ministerial conference, which would focus on a number of environmental related issues. I think there's still work ongoing, so it's not yet 100% clear what precisely would be the scope of that work and the different ways in which trade and climate change and environmental issues intersect. But I think amongst them would be issues around, for example, carbon pricing, that as we've been discussing just now. And if that is decided by the ministers, then there will be a process that will run from after the ministerial conference, where there'll be regular meetings of this committee that will try to develop more concrete elements of what precisely can we, what type of information sharing, what type of coordination can one get, what type of cooperation can one get, for example, around carbon pricing.
Okay. So we have about 2 minutes left, so we're doing the lightning round. The other big event, the international event, I think everyone was watching, is COP26 in Glasgow, coming up in about a month. So you have 2 minutes each to tell me if you think anything will come out of the COP talks that will be related to this issue. Jennifer.
Sorry, I didn't realize you were going to help me first. I actually don't think that the COP is likely to do anything on carbon taxes. Other than just acknowledge that emissions trading systems and acknowledge that there are issues with respect to carbon leakage. But I don't see, a formal, sort of green light or whatever particularly geared to carbon taxes.
Okay.
Border adjustment taxes.
Pasquale or Colin, any thoughts on COP?
Well, I'm more or less on the same side, but I hope that at least having taken the lead on this, as Jennifer said, we'll have to move the waters. So this is a good starting point, and we don't want to go with the unilateral measures. We would like to have everyone on our side, and in this sense, CBAM will be totally offset for all goodwill in countries.
Colin?
I can, so maybe as almost a Glaswegian, which is somebody that comes from Glasgow, I can say that I think that's right. There will not be a specific discussion of these types of issues, but of course, what the European Union wants to see in COP is significant progress on precisely on fighting climate change, and countries taking steps at least comparable to the steps that we've taken. And the more we see that, as Pascal says, the less these issues and the risks of tensions around things like CBAM will be. So hopefully progress. There won't be good weather because it's Scotland in November, but hopefully progress by all participants towards effectively dealing with climate change. Thanks.
Well, there may not be great weather, but there'll be a lot of whiskey, so it all should be well. So I just want to thank you all on behalf of WIT. This was a tremendously interesting program. I know you're all incredibly busy, and I just appreciate your taking an hour of your time to spend with us. And we look forward to continuing the discussion down the road. So Susanna, do you want to close it out? I think I caught her off guard.
You did catch me off guard. Thank you so much to Jennifer, Pasquale, Colin, and to Vanessa. We look forward to seeing you at future WIT events from the Environment and Energy Program. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thanks so much.